In August 1590, John White stepped off a ship onto Roanoke Island after 3 years away. He was looking for his daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 other English settlers. Instead, he found a settlement completely stripped of life. The houses had been carefully taken apart, there were no bodies, and not a single soul was there to greet him. Whoever dismantled this place did it methodically. There were no fresh graves in the soil, there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no ash from burned palisades. Heavy belongings, like bars of iron, were scattered across the dirt, left behind but pointedly not looted by local tribes. Only one word remained to point White towards his family. Carved deep into a wooden post, in heavy capital letters, was the message: Croatoan. White and the settlers had agreed on a protocol before he left. If they were forced out by violence or disaster, they were supposed to carve a cross above their destination. There was no cross on that post. Looking at the bare letters, White deduced that the 118 men, women, and children had packed up and relocated on their own terms. Many accounts frame Roanoke as a ghost story, as if the settlers simply evaporated. But the evidence suggests a physical event. This was a 400-year-old active crime scene, containing specific remnants that allow us to reconstruct their final days. To understand why those people were on that island in the first place, we have to look back to 1585. Queen Elizabeth I was racing against Spain for global dominance. The Spanish were extracting massive amounts of gold and silver from South America. England needed a foothold in the Americas to secure its own wealth and maintain its relevance on the world stage. This map shows the location chosen by the ambitious courtier Sir Walter Raleigh, Roanoke Island, situated off the coast of what is now North Carolina. He envisioned it as a permanent English stronghold. Looking at this same geography, however, reveals a starkly different reality. The island was a geographical trap. It was too small to support the large-scale agriculture needed for a sustainable colony, and its shallow groundwater supply was dangerously contaminated, making clean drinking water scarce. This watercolor, painted by John White himself, shows a highly organized Croatoan village. Raleigh's men weren't stepping into an empty wilderness. They were entering established territory. A previous English military expedition in 1585 had already clashed violently with the Croatoan people, leaving a legacy of deep hostility in the region. Despite those massive liabilities, Raleigh pushed forward. In 1587, he sent John White, an artist, not a soldier, to lead a new group of 118 civilians to build the settlement. This group was severely under-resourced and included women and children. Among them was White's own pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare. Raleigh ignored the bad water, the poor soil, and the hostile neighbors because he needed a rapid political victory against Spain. These colonists were entirely unqualified for the environment they were stepping into, thrust into a political death trap. The consequences of the 1585 expedition caught up with them almost immediately. In July 1587, within weeks of landing, a colonist named George Howe was killed by Native Americans while he was fishing alone in the shallows. The colonists demanded immediate revenge. John White organized a retaliatory raid in the dark, but in the chaos, his men attacked the wrong village. Instead of striking the hostile Croatoan tribe, they massacred members of the Croatoan, the only friendly indigenous group the English had left. That error isolated the colonists completely. Any chance of trading or securing local protection vanished overnight. Facing starvation and surrounded by enemies, the desperate settlers convinced White to sail back to England to secure emergency supplies. He left in August 1587, expecting to return in a few months, but England was now locked in an existential naval war with Spain. Queen Elizabeth commandeered every available English ship to fight the massive Spanish Armada. John White was grounded, trapped on the wrong side of the Atlantic. It took 3 years for him to finally secure a passage back to Roanoke. When he walked into that dismantled fort in 1590, he was looking at the direct result of his own military blunder. He had severed their only lifeline, leaving his family to fend for themselves. Over the centuries, investigators have floated several theories about how the colonists handled that isolation. One persistent idea points south. This photograph shows a Spanish fort in Florida. a reminder that Spain had a highly active military presence on the American coast, leading some to argue a Spanish raiding party traveled north and wiped the English out. But the evidence at the site contradicts a military strike. The Spanish routinely burned rival outposts to the ground, yet the Roanoke homes were taken down piece by piece. There were no bodies left in the dirt, and Spanish naval records from the era contain absolutely no mention of an attack on Roanoke. Another major theory relies on messages allegedly carved by the colonists themselves. In 1937, a man in California presented a carved rock, the first of the so-called Dare stones, claiming to hold a tragic message from Eleanor Dare about the massacre of her husband and child. Over 40 of these stones surfaced, but by 1941, experts had thoroughly investigated and discredited them as elaborate modern forgeries. A much more credible line of inquiry looks westward, proposing that the colonists migrated inland to escape the coast. Researchers have analyzed the modern genetic code of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. DNA studies show European ancestry intertwined with the local population, suggesting possible integration. The strongest historical theory rests on those 7 letters carved into the post. The word points directly toward Hatteras Island, the home of the Croatoan tribe. By the 1700s, European explorers documented encounters with Native Americans in that region who possessed gray eyes and distinct English facial features. When you compile the facts, the absence of graves, the missing distress cross, and the deliberate dismantling of the houses all point in the same direction. The evidence rejects a sudden violent end, and instead outlines a calculated, desperate relocation by a group of people trying to survive. Today, investigators are testing that relocation theory with modern forensics. These are the grassy earthworks at the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site. In 2012, researchers brought ground-penetrating radar to these fields, scanning deep beneath the topsoil. They detected buried patterns that suggest the original structural foundations of the settlement. That technological mapping allowed archaeologists to zero in on peripheral sites. In 2015, digging on Hatteras Island yielded a heavily oxidized copper ring. It was definitively traced back to Elizabethan England, providing the first material link between the vanished settlers and the exact territory of the Croatoan tribe. The forensic net widened again in 2020. The First Colony Foundation focused their excavations on a location labeled Site X, situated 50 miles inland from the original coastal trap. This highlights what they pulled out of the dirt at Site X. These fragments of blue and light pottery match 16th century English styles used by the Roanoke colonists. Finding them buried 50 miles away is physical proof the settlers dispersed inland. Modern archaeology is finally replacing the folklore. The dirt and the artifacts prove that 118 people did not vanish into thin air. When their supply line snapped, they took apart their homes, packed up their tools and ceramics, and adapted to the local environment. The word Croatoan has spent the last 4 centuries as a fixture of American folklore. Roanoke has become the nation's oldest pop culture mystery, inspiring countless books, movies, and the country's longest-running outdoor drama. But we lose something treating the story as a puzzle to be solved. This was a real group of 118 people, abandoned by their empire. It included Eleanor Dare and her infant daughter Virginia, the very first English child born in the Americas. The story of Roanoke is the account of a profound human tragedy. These were families fighting for a foothold on a shore that rejected them, abandoned to a fate of survival and forced adaptation. The Roanoke colony reminds us that history is full of holes, stories that begin but never end. At Vanished Ages, we dig into those holes. We document what disappeared, and we ask, what else has history forgotten? If you want more stories like this, subscribe and hit the bell, because some stories refuse to stay buried. Next week, the Black Death's darkest secret, the plague that killed 50 million and the governments that tried to hide it. This is Vanished Ages. Thanks for watching.